welcome to another edition of the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm Coach Redpill, joined by my co-host, Dr. Benway, and we are going to be discussing something really interesting. Dr. Benway, why don't you give us the intro on this particular topic?
Well, this came out of the fact that I'm kind of familiar with the fact that we do so much contemporary news to the point where everybody gets black-pilled, and I see people saying, well, I woke up happy this morning. Thanks for taking that away. And I recognize it. But I also, so I had that thought. I said, I want to do something different. But I also had the other thought, which I remember from a few episodes past. Don't ask me which number. Even I can't remember them. That, we said that, part of the thing you want to avoid is kind of that isolated, bias confirmation, right. Stagnation that you really get in certain circles, like, we only read books that, are kind of pre-approved for us.
Yeah, exactly.
So I kind of like, let's blend the two together. Let's, not do the depressing news, but let's also do something out of our wheelhouse here. And I said to you, like, look, I actually want to do something a little daring. I want to talk about, be it books, movies, TV shows, whatever, that does have a distinctly left-wing bias, or a message, I should say, but are good, are compelling, are worth the effort.
Yeah.
And I said, so hopefully we kill two birds with one stone, or maybe we'll annoy the hell out of people who just hate some of the people we're going to talk about. But I don't think you guys are going to have that response. I think you're going to say, let's dive into it.
Well, I find it interesting, the question of why is it that so much of contemporary art is left-wing dominated? I find that question very interesting because it is. No right-winger is producing any kind of interesting art. And, I've read some of the alternative right pieces and books and what have you, and they're not very good. As a professional writer, I can say that some of it is kind of borderline incompetent. And nothing right-wing on the alt side is compelling. And insofar as the mainstream, well, there's nothing. There is nothing that is being produced that has a right-wing sensibility, except perhaps Mel Gibson's movies, to tell you the truth. Because Apocalypto was extremely right-wing, if you think about it, and extremely pro-European conquest of the Americas, if you think about it. It was there, plain as day, but not banging you over the head. The left-wingers tend to have this habit of banging you over the head with their ideology, sometimes to the detriment of the actual work of art, like, for instance, The Last Jedi and other Star Wars movies.
Right. Well, my take is, in contemporary world, two thoughts. One, I think a lot of, if there's going to be right-wing art where someone's actually going to be very adamant about it and say, I'm going to be as stern with my right-wing message as a left-winger, that's going to be hard to come by. One, because I think, there are certain types of people who don't easily lend themselves to that kind of art, and right-wingers tend to not be that case. But besides that point, I think, you've established kind of gatekeepers to prevent that from happening in a mainstream kind of setting. Well, so to the extent to which these works of art kind of potentially exist, I think they're just going to be hard to come by. But I think what does happen is you do see right-wing messages by accident or hidden in TV shows. Like, for example, I would say that the YouTube show Cobra Kai, it unmistakably can be read in a conservative right-wing way, not the least of which is your hero, who was the villain in the original movie.
Yeah.
Is legitimately a unreconstructed 80s man. Yeah. And the whole story is about fathers attempting to become the role of fathers and doing it poorly, but are trying to do it better.
Yeah.
It just can't beat you over the head with it.
Yeah, but hang on, stepping back a little, I want to look at the macro question, because right before we started recording this episode, you and I were talking, and you mentioned something quite accurate, which is that, actors tend to be left-wing because, of course, actors have a kind of twisted view of reality. How is it that you...
Yeah, so they have an ambiguous relationship to order and structure and authority. Think about it. I mean, you're dealing with a person whose livelihood is to pretend to be someone else.
Yeah.
And under certain conditions, in certain schools of performance, particularly the Lee Strasberg school, you convince yourself you're someone else to a certain extent.
Yeah, exactly.
And when that someone has an ambiguous relationship with reality, with what it means to be themselves, with what it means to be man, woman, what have you. I think the best movie that kind of depicts this, honestly, is Tootsie.
Yeah. Brilliantly, actually. Yeah.
And so when you're dealing with someone like that, they're not going to lend themselves too easily to making the case for the need for structured order, hierarchy, and in the idea that things are in their place, right?
Yeah, but there's something else that it's precisely that ambiguous relationship to reality and this problems with structure that allows these left-wing artists to make artistic breakthroughs that are rather interesting, that sort of like give you a different view of reality. Whereas the right-winger, he's not going to have that the problem with reality or authority, and therefore he's not really going to break through to anything. Is that could be a thesis as to why left-wingers tend to dominate the arts, and the most interesting art tends to come from left-wingers. Aside, of course, from like the Russian novelists.
Well, yeah, Russian novelists right off the bat tend, or like we said, I said that during the conversation. They're invariably, it doesn't matter what period of history either. They're all right wing, or they're all religious to a certain extent. Someone can say that Tolstoy, he influenced a lot of left wing minded people.
But he was right.
Let's not get carried away with what Tolstoy was doing here. He was Christian more than anything else.
Yeah, exactly.
But there is some weird things that do happen with right wing art where they're simultaneously crazy right wing, but do have an ambiguous relationship with themselves in reality. And you can see that both in the writings of and the film about his life, Mishima.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For those of you who don't know, is an aristocratic Japanese author who, I may have even mentioned this before, was, eventually, he was kind of like a weakly little boy, but as he was growing up, and he was also kind of basically bisexual, he grew to try to develop and curate a strong masculinity within him, a reverence for Japanese tradition and order, and his life ultimately culminated with him raising his own private army, storming the gates of a military barracks in Tokyo.
Yeah.
It wasn't truly a military because technically Japan doesn't have a standing army. They have a defense force. But he captured the leader of that garrison, went out to the balcony, demanded that the people rise up and restore the emperor to the throne of Japan. And obviously it failed and he killed himself. In the traditional Japanese way, he committed seppuku. He gutted himself and had his subordinate behead him. In the most traditional Japanese. And the funny thing is, he made a film with this very conclusion about the seppuku act. I forgot the name of it, but he was prepared to do this. For a very long time.
No, so he did a nut job. I mean, that guy had a seriously ambiguous relationship to reality. But no, my wider point, we're talking about Mishima, but I don't want to get bogged down in Mishima's story. I'm interested in the notion that left-wingers, because of their ambivalent relationship to authority and reality, the art that they produce tends to be pushing both, pushing the bounds of reality and the bounds of authority. And those bounds of authority being encapsulated by the rules of the art form. They break through those rules, and they make interesting art that a right-winger or somebody with a more conservative mentality wouldn't have occurred to him to do that. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I think the film, at least the filmmaker, we can go into literary figures as well. But the guy who immediately comes to mind doing that well is Bernardo Bertolucci.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Bernardo Bertolucci has made a number of very great films that are just obviously left-wing. But I think the one that comes immediately to mind that I think right-wingers would appreciate would be The Conformist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, The Conformist is a story of a man who basically becomes an assassin for the fascist government of Italy.
Yeah, because he's homosexual.
The premise of the movie was that, well, he's not necessarily homosexual. When he was a young boy, a homosexual driver basically abused him, and he lashed out against this man and has this wounded anger, and he feels that there's something wrong about him, that he's different from others, and his desire to approach fascism is predicated on the fact that he doesn't want to be different. He wants to be like everyone else. So if he thinks if he becomes a fascist, in structure and authority, think this scar on his personality will be hidden. It's a Freudian take. Ultimately, I don't think it really tells you the truth about why people become fascists.
No, yeah.
But I think in this story, it's compelling, and it's one of his earlier films, and you see a fantastical use of visuals and music and space, which he continues to develop through the rest of his career and equally interesting movies. But I would also give him this: even though he's a left winger, he still makes the fascists interesting,
Yeah,
even the
what's
non
interesting about the conformist is in a weird way, it came out what in 70, 71, but
like
weirdly,
71. Yeah,
yeah, it created the visuals for the 1980s because I think of the conformist as an 80s picture because the look of it, like for instance when it has that those shots of the Venetian blinds, right, and the horizontal lines slicing across the girlfriend, what's her name, and
yeah.
yeah, and those shots, right? Th- that is just so 80s. That clean kind of minimalist look, very 80s. Very. I can almost see the videos from the 80s directed by Adrian Lyne. Just ripping off the conformist. It really was an influential picture on a visual level. But what I find interesting about left wing art, whenever I think of left wing art or art that I am on a philosophical level completely opposed to, I think of the Cider House Rules. That is the book that for me is really interesting, and I think it captures the difference between left wingers and right wingers insofar as our appreciation of art. Because quickly, the Cider House Rules, the novel, is a pro-abortion novel, and there is rather one climactic moment that is outstanding, really, where an abortion is performed, and the way that John Irving has written the scene and the lead up to the scene, it is almost like a deliverance. It's almost you almost feel like the angels singing as this abortion is performed because it's performed on this girl who was sexually abused by her father, by her biological father. A deeply disturbing implication. I mean, all that is deeply disturbing, of course. But when the abortion scene finally happens, it really is like an angelic deliverance. It's really bizarre, right? And it's incredibly effective. I mean, if you're on the fence on the issue of abortion, you get to that scene, to that climax, and you're like, yeah, I'm pro-abortion. I mean, after this, sure, I'm absolutely pro-abortion. Uh, my own take was when I read it, I was indifferent to the question. At the time I read it, I was 19, and I was indifferent to the question of abortion because it just didn't affect me, of course. And so I was 19, a 19-year-old doesn't care about anything that doesn't affect him directly. And I was reading it, and I didn't have a clear idea of what I thought of abortion. I'm completely opposed to it now, by the way. The only exception would be an ectopic pregnancy, but be that as it may, I read it, and I remember admiring the craft and the technique used to be able to pull off this moment, because I was moved by the scene, even though at that time even I was thinking to myself, maybe I'm not in favor of abortion. But I was moved by the scene. I was amazed by the technique. I was amazed by the skill and craft with which John Irving was able to pull off this moment, really, really effectively. And I thought, and I think now to myself that a left winger would not be able to admire somebody doing that. They would hate him. They would hate the writer.
Well, here's my suspicion is that you were able to detect the technique in part because you didn't believe in the abortion thing as a great moral necessity to have it, right? So because of that, you're not, just bought in like at the surface level of the story. So you can distance yourself from it, and then you're able to see the technique, right?
Well, perhaps.
Because I think that is actually the case. I think once you don't come with the customers, you're able to see how the pudding's made.
Okay, fair enough. But the thing is, the point I want to make though is that a right winger such as myself can admire the technique of an art that they, on a philosophical level, are completely against or outright despise. I mean, my own sense, I completely disagree with John Irving on the abortion issue, and in a very real sense, I think that the Cider House Rules is morally an evil novel, and yet I can admire it, and I'm not calling for it to be banned. Of course not. But a left winger cannot confront an art that they can't answer or that they disagree with that kind of equanimity. It would never occur to me to ban the Cider House Rules, even though I think it's an incredibly effective novel that really sells the idea of being pro-choice, of being pro-abortion. It really sells it. I could just never. I, no, I could never bring myself to ban such a work. I would never be afraid of those ideas. But a left winger, and if it were the opposite, if it were a pro life novel, a left winger would call for its banning. You see the point? A left winger would only be able to say would only deplore the novel and say crappy things. I think it's an amazing novel. I truly do. I think it's an amazing novel that not only gets the job done, but it gets the job done, extremely well. But you see the point I'm trying to make here is that the left wing audience, okay, left wing creators push the envelope, but a left wing audience cannot accept the message that disagrees with them. You see what I'm saying? A right wing audience can, or do you think it's just the political moment we're living in today?
Well, here I look at it a little differently, and I would phrase it this way. I think you can certainly are going to have audiences with left wing tendencies who nonetheless are there to see like read an interesting book or have an interesting story on film or what have you. There'll be that. I think the truly left wingers, in terms of politically minded folks, this is, I think, the crux of it. They don't see art as an end in and of itself. Everything to them is propaganda. So if you see everything as propaganda, you don't really care how effective it is. You just care what the message is, and then you'll fight against the message, right? I think when they're operating on that level, they don't give a fucking shit. They'll just to ban or not to ban. It's all a matter of tactics. I think if you had someone who actually was interested in the literature or not, that they'd have a different story. I also think a lot of right wingers, I think the right wing types who might be inclined to ban, frankly, don't read to begin with. Yeah. I also don't think the left wing propagandists read either. So I think, and it's kind of reminds me of basically the Huxley point in Brave New World, which was, we don't really have to ban any books because no one reads them. You know what I mean? So I think there's that effect because that kind of relates to me, like to your point, like why I wouldn't want to ban a number of left-wing books. Well, partly because of books or film, partly because I think a number of the successful left-wing books, films, whatever I like, tend to have a very interesting eye to detail. So I think that part of the thing that I've always kind of railed against in literature and film, what have you, is I'm not a big fan of realism overall. Once you accept like realism as a rule, and you say you have to have things be quote unquote realistic, no sets, no artificiality, no weird dialogue. It's just strictly this is exactly what happened. I feel it can get constricting. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, when someone does it well, I think it's a really great kind of cataloging of details that are always interesting to keep in mind of. And in terms of literature, the guy who immediately comes to mind would be Upton Sinclair. If you ever read The Jungle, which was about the Chicago meatpacking industry, amongst other, or oil, or even if you do some of John Steinbeck's books, particularly Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men. Yeah, he has some stylistic things in there, but they're really good catalogs of this happens, and logically, these are the details of the reality accompanying these events. So you're forced, this Lithuanian family is forced into hard labor. They go to a meatpacking industry. You get the details and what that is. It's very interesting to me. And even it goes up to, like you'll hate that I'll say this, but even like Roger and Me, it's a documentary. It's Michael Moore's first film, but it's a very, if you want to know, hey, GM closes a factory in Flint. Point A, what are all the details that happen? You get it. You get all the details there. What's funny about that one in particular, I feel like Michael Moore would prefer not to mention that movie now because that is so much in line with what Trump would have said, what Trump would have understood as a problem. Bitching about the fact that, factories are going overseas to cheap labor in Mexico. The American worker gets shafted by wealthier people who don't give a fucking shit. They're just to collect their scratch. All that's the richness and attention to detail that I think you'll get in a lot of left-wing works that I appreciate.
Yeah, but those are journalistic efforts if you think about it. Okay, I'm thinking more of artistic.
That's too dismissive. I mean,
No, no,
there is an artistic.
I'm not saying.
There's an artistic element to that.
Well, it's a craft. It's not so much an artistic vision. Okay, it's a craft. It's well crafted. I mean, like Upton Sinclair. I think he won the Nobel Prize, didn't he? But he if he did, he didn't deserve it because he was a good craft.
Steinbeck won the Nobel Prize.
Yeah, no, Steinbeck did. Yeah, I know. But I thought Upton Sinclair did too. I'll look it up, but it's not very important. I think that a lot of these guys, Upton Sinclair and Michael Moore, are of the same line. If Upton Sinclair had had portable video cameras, he'd be shooting documentaries today. So left-wing documentaries at that. So I look at these writers, and sure, like Upton Sinclair, of the other muckrakers of the time, he had more craft, more ability as a writer, but it was the same thing. It was the same genre, it was the same approach. He wasn't really interested. I mean, there were some artistic flourishes. Yeah, sure. Like at the end of Grapes of Wrath, and well, actually, I don't know if in the book, The Grapes of Wrath, there's that great speech like in the end of the movie, The Grapes of Wrath. Is there?
Yeah, that's in the book.
Okay. I actually forgot. I mean, I read the book. I had to in high school, and I just found it completely unmemorable. I found the movie much more memorable, or maybe it's just my imagination that latched onto the movie more than to the book. But the point I'm trying to make is that, see, it's done with a little bit more craft, a little more elan, if you will, to use a very pretentious word. But it's the same thing as journalism. Okay, it's not like really art. Like for instance, like Cider House Rules has a lot of interesting.
You go ahead, but I'm not going to play that game.
What?
No, make your argument. The idea that this is journalistic talent. It's less there. I don't buy that pile of bullshit to step one, but you make the case.
But look, I mean, like some of it, you have to see where it's coming from in initial impulse. I think that defines what an art is, whether it's an art or not. Don't you agree, or you think different?
Well, no. Every act of journalism is a matter of decisions as to say what you include, what you don't include, and when you include it. Mm-hmm. And that's the same logical sequencing, the same stylistic sequencing that literature has. And frankly, the whole argument of new journalism was that there's no real difference when you cut to the to the meat of it.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. I see your point. I'm not going to argue because it's not an argument that I really care about one way or the other. If this is art or this is journalism. For me, it's all content. I don't really care. The only thing I care about is that if somebody claims that something is journalistically accurate, it better fucking be journalistically accurate and not just a pile of bullshit. It better not be like Margaret Mead. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. If you want to write your fiction and that the South Pacific Islanders live in this, the perfect state of nature kind of thing, fine, but call it a novel. Don't call it, sociology or anthropology as she did. But the point, I see that you can make art out of that which is factual, which is, of course, the whole point of In Cold Blood, for instance, which is I would say, the granddaddy of new journalism, of basically taking factually accurate events and turning it into literature. No problem with that. I don't have a problem with it, but what I'm saying is, I guess that there is some sort of like dividing line between that which is journalistic and that which is artistic. It's not necessarily a very bright line, but we tend to focus and look at the one or the other in different ways. And I'm more interested in the artistic stuff.
Well, I mean, it's kind of related, though. I mean, the left-wing art that I also appreciate is, and it's the same with any kind of art, frankly, is related to the extent to which they capture the details and nuances of all human beings. So I'll give you an example that I like, and it was actually the first that came to mind when I was thinking about this, in part because it's August when we're recording this. It's, we're in the hot days of summer. I thought to myself, you know what the best summer movie is? Not in the sense that, summer blockbuster, but like movie about, and that takes place within summer and gets it right. Do the Right Thing.
Yeah.
So, those of you who may or may not be aware, 1989, Spike Lee's movie. So, A Day in the Life. It's like we're in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn neighborhood, black area, hot motherfucking day, no air conditioning around to be seen. All of the details of the people in the town, and the big kind of central point is this pizzeria run by Danny Aiello and his two sons, one of which is John Turturro. And it's the slow accumulation of everybody being more or less decent people, more or less, eventually having their own kind of annoyances and prejudices, ultimately build up to a point of extreme conflict at the end.
Right.
But what happens in that movie, and in a lot of left-wing art that I do enjoy, is that even though if you were to talk to Spike Lee about it, he has one particular point of view. It's the people are there to fuck black people, and the cops were there to kill someone and fight the powers that be. But if you watch the film, you see that the white Italian owner of the pizzeria is a human being. You understand that he's putting his life and energies work into this business. It means something to him above and beyond the property value, whatnot. And so when you get to the climax of the film, which the violence is done to a person and to this shop, you understand why he has such an extreme defensiveness to anybody who would dare damage and destroy that which he's built up. The film has a richness to it above and beyond just the particular message that Spike would have. In fact, if you listen to Spike Lee, the message almost makes the film seem stupider than it really is.
Yeah.
And there's other literature that kind of is successful at that as well, that has a left-wing slant. Admittedly, I can't think of one immediately to mind, largely because I haven't read a lot of new literature in the most recent years.
No,
but I'm sure you can pick your
no.
poison.
Look. Bottom line, we have to admit that over the last 20 years, it's been a barren wasteland insofar as literature is concerned. I mean, come on, really, anything. Just name me one thing that pops to mind, American or English, or I mean British, right? It's been a wasteland. I mean, really, like it's been like just mediocrity after mediocrity, masquerading as high art, and it's not. It's pathetic. I mean, tell me, name me one thing that you think that is any good. To tell you the truth, I always think that the best novel of the last, or one of the best novels of the last 30 years was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Really. That was the third Harry Potter. That was when J.K. Rowling had a little bit of discipline left in her, insofar as, and it was a remarkable story, remarkably imaginative, but other than that, I can't think of anything that's decent or halfway decent. I'm asking you, really, can you think of one decent novel over the last?
I'll say the names, and you're going to shit on them, and I don't care.
Okay.
House of Leaves, Wonder Boys.
House of Leaves. That was just so stupid. I read it.
You're predictable, and you're taking a big dump on something that's actually very interesting. I actually think that was the book.
It's interesting, like a dumpster fire.
Let me finish. Let me finish. You can take a dump when I'm done. That's a book that actually takes the premises of postmodernism and makes it somewhat compelling. It actually does make a very interesting kind of horror story out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, that's a step above a lot of the things you did get during that period. I think for someone who can actually know how to use the techniques of this period and do it well, I say God bless them. That actually is a book I actually am interested in reading.
Okay, yeah. When did that book come out? In 99?
99, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll give you House of Leaves because there was some of it that was kind of interesting. What else? Like Franzen, it was just up against the wall. That's as far as I'm concerned. All of.
Well, I mean, I didn't mention a Franzen book, but I would say I enjoyed.
Oh, by the way,
Wonder Boy.
But just a parenthesis. Did you see that incredibly banal interview of him in the New York Times?
No, I don't. I don't watch or pay attention to him.
Oh man, you should have read it. It was this. It was just so like ass kissing interview, and just like everything coming out of his mouth was like perfect kind of thing, and it was just so banal and pathetic. He's just like living in New Mexico, and I just find it so pathetic. It was just so. Okay, well, if you haven't read it, then it's pointless to talk about it. But like, okay, getting back on track to this, what's been of any decent piece of literature over the last 20 years? Okay, House of Leaves. Okay, mildly interesting. Wonder Boys. I don't know. I've always thought that Michael Chabon was just overrated, just across the board. Okay. What else? Who else?
There is this book called Netherland, which I kind of enjoyed.
Oh, which one was that? I heard it.
That was about it was basically a guy in finance.
Oh yeah, I hated that book. I hated
during
that piece of shit. Yeah, and I know why it was published. By the
because
way, I know why it was published. Yeah, I read that book. Yeah, yeah, and he was like living by himself. He was playing cricket with these Pakistanis, and they were like the only cricket club in New York or some shit like that, right? And this guy was like a Dutchman, and he was playing cricket with these Pakistanis, and he was having problems with his wife because his wife had banged some other guy. And by the way, no way was that fucker in corporate finance. He just didn't have the killer instinct in him to be there. No fucking way was he that
no,
guy.
no. He wasn't in corporate finance. He was a analyst. He was a research analyst. That does not require
Yeah, well, maybe.
you to be cutthroat.
Yeah, okay. Then I miss. But yeah,
mean,
and the guy,
he was
such a cuck. I mean, he was a literal cuck. He goes to some barbecue where his wife's lover is there, and his wife's lover is like basically like winking and giving a nudge, right? And it was just so pathetic. I mean, when I can't really admire a piece of work where I find the main character pathetic, okay, but a truly pathetic.
See, that's where I have a different approach to literature than you do. My attitude is the book making the case that this man being is you would say a cuck, is that a good thing? The book really isn't making the case. Is the book just depicting what a guy like that is going to be? Yeah, to me that can still be interesting, frankly, because I am not of this belief that I have to identify.
No, yeah, okay, fair enough. No, yeah.
That's a very child. I mean, not to dismiss you or something, but you shit on me, I shit on you.
No, yeah.
That's a childish demand of a book. I'm sorry.
Well, no. You're right. Yeah, because we're not 12 years old. We're not reading, Danny Dunn and the homework machine.
It's the Hardy Boys.
Yeah, exactly. No, I understand, but the thing is, see, it was a first person narrator, I believe, right? And he was undistinguishable as a narrator. I mean, he wasn't breaking any kind of new ground, or even remotely new ground insofar as narration. But I just found him just pathetic, okay? And when it's a first-person narrator, I find it hard to be interested in someone whom I consider pathetic. I mean, I read along to find out what was going on. The stuff that was interesting was the stuff about the cricket club. That was kind of interesting. And I remember there was one character who's this Indian fellow or Pakistani, and they became friends, and something happened. I forget what, but I mean, I read it when it came out. When it came out, in 2012 or something like that.
2009. It's hard for me to accept the fact that 2009 is almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So let us never speak of that again. I don't want to feel old.
Okay. Well, I was just not.
The thing I liked about it, and maybe this is just me liking technique or something, but you had mentioned, like, for an uncompelling first person, it's hard to get into it. Superficially, I get it. I think what's happening in that book is, and I think the critic James Wood in the New Yorker, who's also someone worth paying attention to.
Yeah.
He's vaguely left wing, but I mean, he's more like, there's good art here. I don't care about the politics. There's good art. You have to define how to get to it.
Yeah.
He had a very good take on that book in general, but it's about something he talks about. Take on that book in particular, but it's about something he talks about in general, which is that it's a great phenomenon you get with good writers, which is you can have first person, but the way that the novel is written, it's a semi-third person. By that, I mean, yes, you have what the first person is taken, but almost like an unreliable narrator, you don't entirely view him in the way that he's viewing himself. You have the askew response to it. The other option of that, this isn't a book like that, but there's other books he's given examples of where it's, third person, first person, which is to say it's a book told in the third person, but because it's so tightly wound around a particular character, you still get a vibe that it's a sympathetic third person. It's almost, they have like a psychological link, and you're getting the vague implications of like a first person attitude towards it. And Netherland does have that technique. Like I said, it's just the opposite. It's that first case of the situation. So I kind of enjoyed that, and it played into my point earlier, which is to say I was okay not liking the main character because the book is not meant for you to like him. The other great example of that, frankly, even though it's much older, and I actually think now that I look back at it, Netherland stole some from it, was Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye is a first-person story in which the older you get and you watch and you read it, the less the less you sympathize with the narrator.
Yeah.
And in a weird way, you kind of come full circle. It's like you don't, let me put it this way. You don't take his bullshit at face value, but you empathize with his predicament.
Yeah. I haven't read Catcher in the Rye in decades. I mean, I honestly, I don't think I've picked up that book in 20 years, easy. Though I can remember, lots of it. But yeah,
I'll say this, the macro point, though, that I don't want to escape from. I'll give you this. In the past 20 some odd years, I haven't encountered a top tier book. You know what I mean? A book that I'm like, I'll remember that 100 years from now. I won't, because I'll be dead. But if I were alive, I'd remember it from 100 years ago. Yeah, I haven't encountered something like that.
Wait, I can think of one, Ravelstein, which is indicative, by the way. Because Ravelstein, when did they come out? In the early
2000.
2000. Okay. Now, Ravelstein, it was a memorable book. Okay, it wasn't, in Bellow's body of work, it wasn't that outstanding. It was a last hurrah, if you will, and it was sort of like middle of the pack if we're ranking all of his novels, right? But the fact that was a middle of the pack Bellow book is memorable, and little else is. Jesus Christ. Now that's not fucking good, now is it? And by the way, a quick note, you and I should do like a comparison of we should do a dual read of Ravelstein and The Closing of the American Mind. Because, for readers who don't know, Ravelstein is Bellow's book. It's basically a roman à clef about Alan Bloom, the famous University of Chicago professor, who wrote the famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, which came out in 1986, which for all intents and purposes predicted almost to the letter what was going to happen over the next 30 years insofar as higher education is concerned. And he predicted, it's in the title of his book. He predicted that eventually the left-wing academia would get to the point of trying to prohibit that which can be known. Would try to censor people. And here we are, I think we should do a podcast, like a dual podcast. Yeah, just an idea throwing out there, and like, let's get back on topic.
I do that.
Yeah.
No, I do. And you brought up another point, which is a lot of the novels I am enjoying in relatively recent times, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are from writers who were already working at it before 1980, let's say.
Yeah.
So, when Thomas Pynchon writes a new book, good or ill, I'm going to read it. I'll probably enjoy pieces of it, but the guy has been writing since the 60s.
Yeah.
Same thing when Philip Roth would write a book. Same thing when John Updike would write a book. Same thing when, go down the list, those guys are all dying off now. I mean, Philip Roth was the last guy.
Yeah.
Like Thomas Pynchon's the last one, and Don DeLillo and Cormac McCarthy are, the three that immediately come to mind.
Don DeLillo, yeah. I've always felt that he was like a second tier, just like try hard, not really like in the top of the league. I know that everybody loves Don DeLillo for some reason, but I just find him, no big deal, he's there's something about him that Thomas Pynchon or even other not top tier writers have, because Don DeLillo is so obviously worried about his professional esteem, of how other people take him. Okay, and that's the thing about him that I find kind of, he just doesn't go for it. He's actually worried about his career. You see what I'm saying? And
Well,
I
I've never gotten that read from him, but who am I to deny your interpretation?
no, 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 it's just a vibe I'm getting, of actually being concerned about the career, as opposed to being at a level of like, okay, I can publish anything I fucking want, so I'm going to publish stuff that I want to.
Well, I'll tell you though, now that you mentioned it, because we talked about Don DeLillo, it's a little bit different from the left wing writers, right? It's the one series, the one writer, kind of pulpy writer, who I still get a kick out of to this day, who's still writing them and belching them out pretty well, is John, James Ellroy. The
Yeah,
guy who did L.A. Confidential. He had a great trilogy of books, pretty much about like the conspiratorial minded side of America.
yeah,
Like it was an American Tabloid,
that
The
was a
Cold
great book.
6000, and then Bloods Are Over. All the first book is like leads up to the JFK assassination. The second book is immediately after JFK's dead, and it's right wing pulpy. It's like JFK. I'll summarize Camelot. It was like look good, kick ass, and get laid while doing it, or some version of that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't have the lines in front of me, but that's just old fashioned, fuck it all. It's like genre fiction. But and that's it's a rare breed. He
Well,
gets
yeah,
away with it largely
he's
because
like
he's made a lot of money and he's made very famous films have been made of his work.
very good films. Well, no, Black Delilah was not a very good picture, but L.A. Confidential was a great picture. I mean, that was a flat out great picture. Um, I remember the American Tabloid when I read it when it came out. I was blown away by it. I thought that technically it was an incredible piece of work, and it was really interesting because when I read it, I was blown away by its technique and how it was written and everything. But even at that time, I was what 27. I didn't internalize that style. As I found it really interesting observing myself that you come to a point where you don't automatically internalize somebody else's style. You get to a point where you have your own style, and you'll internalize certain elements of somebody else's style because this is very useful. This is it's good to know, or a good approach to a certain problem. But you're not going to internalize a style like just bring it all in. You know what I mean? When you're younger, you do, but when you get to a certain point and you no longer do that. Oh, but that's a side point insofar as writing is concerned. No, yeah, James Ellroy, but James Ellroy is really not political. James Ellroy is sort of like, if I had to guess, I'd say libertarian, but like,
No, 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 no. He may be playing it up a bit, but you know, he's got his father's a German.
mhm.
What more needs to be said? An old-fashioned German. A Nazi. No, I'm kidding. His father's not a Nazi, but yeah, he's very fond of the police. He's very much an authority figure. He is critical in his books of abuses of authority. So you just watch or read L.A. Confidential
Yeah,
to see who the real villain of that story is. But he fucking hates the Kennedys. He certainly hates the Clintons.
yeah,
Didn't care for Obama. He hasn't said much about Donald Trump, but he's a crude, rude, right wing attitude kind of guy. Thinks any kind of degeneracy, is not to be tolerated. Fun guy for our crowd.
yeah,
Let me just say that.
yeah. But his star has sort of faded. To tell you the truth, I haven't really heard that much about him as of late, or maybe the news sources that I keep abreast of to find out what's what insofar as books are concerned, they don't talk about him much.
Well, his last new book, I think, was a few years ago, and he's working on another either trilogy or quartet, the second LA quartet. So the last book he had that came out was in 2014. It's called Perfidia,
Hmm.
and it was about. I think it's about the Zoot Suit riots, if
Hmm.
I'm not mistaken. I haven't read it yet, uh, but kind of he's trying to get there. But like, and I remember some attention made at the time, but he's a guy who takes his time between books. We could just be getting a lull. I think his new book is going to come out this year. We'll see if he gets attention for it. He may very well be coming out at the wrong time or the right time.
We'll see. Yeah,
God will determine.
yeah, because there was a time when he was producing. I think he got to a point of actually producing two books a year. I mean, he was like a maniac, right? I mean, just cranking them out. And then, like in the '90s, then he started to slow down. Then he got to a point in his career that he could afford to take time between books. And yeah, he did American Tabloid, and then the Cold 6000, it was called, because I never read it.
Yeah.
I didn't read the subsequent two books of that trilogy. Um, because
Well, there's a long difference because, like, I think American Tabloid's like 96, 97,
95.
95. Sorry, Cold 6000's 2001, and Bloods of Rovers 2009. I'm sure he was doing shit in between,
Yeah,
but he took his time.
yeah. I met him once at a bookstore. Got a picture with him and everything. Nice fellow, nice guy. He signed one of my books or something, and he was tall. He's like 6'2", 6'3", and just very friendly, very easygoing kind of guy. Yeah.
Mhm.
But no, I think that James Ellroy. It was really interesting because in the '90s, in the mid '90s, when American Tabloid came out, and then shortly thereafter, L.A. Confidential. L.A. Confidential came out in '97, I do believe, right? His reputation, his whole impact on the zeitgeist sort of like peaked. And then he's been like, it seems to me that the mainstream, at least the mainstream media, has politely ignored him. Is that my reading into it, or would you agree?
I don't honestly know too well. I mean, because like it's funny because the only time I see stuff pop up about him is, frankly, when he's got a new book out or when I look for it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I'll give you this. I mean, it's not like Oprah's putting him on the show and
Yeah.
say like, hey, do your thing, and he's like, panty sniffers, you fucking whore. He doesn't lend himself well to Oprah's book club. I'll give him that.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, yeah, I mean, it could very well be the fact that they're not particularly interested in giving him an extra boost, but I think he's the kind of author that he's got his reputation, he's got his crowd, they follow him.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of within genre if there's a left winger comes anywhere close to that.
No.
I can't really think of one, or at least so no one who's overtly that way. I do know. I mean, here's another bit of literature I did enjoy. It's a guy who is a left winger at the end of the day. It was a genre book of kind of weird fiction or horror fiction. It was called I think it was like North American Lake Monsters. It was from an author who literally was working as like a waiter to make sure that there was enough money for him and his kid.
Mm-hmm.
But he wrote like these very interesting monster stories, which you could tell are manifestations of things that happened in his life. Like there's one about the deterioration of a married couple's relationship, and it turns out the woman actually is a monster, and that's partly why that this thing isn't going to work out. Other kind of weird takes on, be it either vampirism or any kind of weird creatures.
Who's this author?
Nathan Bullegrund.
Nathan Bullegrund. I've never heard of him, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, he's one of those guys who, if you're in genre.
How do you spell his last name?
Weird fiction. Ballingrund. Ballingrud.
Ballingrud. We'll leave a link in the description. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, but like the thing is, it's not as if he's preaching a left-wing attitude. I just know he's left-wing.
Mm-hmm.
But those were very compelling stories. I have to give him credit, but it's one of those things like if I didn't tell you, you would have never found it.
Yeah. Never heard of this guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm looking at his books. He's got North American Lake Monsters.
Yeah, that's the one that I was recommending.
Yeah, and he's got also The Visible Filth. Catchy title.
I haven't read it.
And The Atlas of Hell will come out in 2019. He's got, I think, good titles, by the way. The Visible Filth and The Atlas of Hell, those are good titles. Memorable. And The Visible Filth is being adapted into a feature film by Annapurna Pictures with Babak Anvari, I don't know who that is, a British-Iranian filmmaker, attached as director. Huh.
I mean, I laugh because I often think to myself, oh, well, maybe they'll get a good creative voice behind it. And I'm like, oh, I don't even know who that is.
Yeah. No,
kind of thing. I mean, that's the thing. Well, this is the other potential thought that you have. I mean, it's a question of when you do have left-wing minded individuals, are you even getting memorable books? We kind of hinted at it, but maybe that they're not even interested, maybe because they know it's not a good propaganda arm anymore. For example, I mean, can you really think of, even if it's bad and you hate it, like a book that really was meant to be kind of like the jungle again? I'm going to write
no,
this book,
no,
and as a
no.
result, people are
I,
going to,
I've thought a lot about it as of late. Why we have a dearth of good literature, and yet we have this literary fiction genre, chugging along. Um, I think it's the universities, the college system in the United States and the UK, that has completely warped the arts, and especially literature. Because you see, okay, so you have all these universities, right? And everybody wants to be a writer, but relatively few people can cut it as a writer, okay? Because the talent to be a writer, a professional writer, is not that common. You can learn a lot of technique and a lot of this and that and the other, but there's like an indescribable something that separates the wheat from the chaff. So anyway, all these people want to be writers, so they take all these creative writing courses. So all these universities have these creative writing courses that employ all of these quote unquote writers who've got an MFA from God knows what. And these people churn out their own fictions, and they are published by presses because, as literary fiction, because the people who are going to buy these books often as not are the very students of these professors. See, so it's the money is coming in via the students taking on debt to pay for these courses and pay for these books. Okay, and so these professors who are teaching creative writing are producing this work that they will have an audience because they'll publish the book with some one of the big six presses, right, or big five at this point, presses, and they'll put out the book with a relatively meager advance for the author. And the book will sell a couple of thousand copies, but that's enough because that way the author has the professor rather has a book that was commercially published, and so that works on his resume. That works on him getting a job or securing a position on a creative writing department in some university, right? And so he's able to secure his position, and he gets his own students to read the book that he wrote because he'll say that in it there are examples of what he's talking about, blah blah, and it becomes this little industry. See, the money flowing in from the students taking on the debt, because the money flows to the students, and the students use it to pay the tuition, which pays for these creative writers' salary, these creative writing professors' salaries, and it pays for the books that are published with the mainstream publishers. So it's this great little industry, and the college university complex has skewed what's valuable or not. What's valuable is not whether the book is actually good. What's valuable is the professional prestige of the professor in the university ecosystem. Um, do you see the model that I'm trying
well,
to?
they have you coming and going. That being said, a number of kids in school could just choose not to read the book and do well enough in the class too.
Yeah, but they buy it anyway.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they do.
No.
But yeah, fair. I mean, fair enough. But I do, it's, it's not as if people are not reading left-wing minded, shit. I mean, I'm pretty sure if you want to choose, half of young adult fiction, right, has some sort of left-wing acceptable stance.
Half, all of it, all of it. You have no idea what YA is like right now. I mean, you got to check it out. That is a fucking nightmare. I've been following that genre for reasons of my own, but that genre is a fucking nightmare. Okay, the left wingism, the kind of like bullying, kind of like everybody pointing at an author because, like for instance, there was some book that came out recently that the author was writing about some Native American character, and the author was not Native American, and they all dogpiled on this author. I forget the exact details of the story. It's not important really, because it just indicates the mentality of it, the mentality of dogpiling, of like junior high school girls all deciding to bully one of the of the girls there because of reasons. You know what I'm saying? No, it's a nightmare. It's a nightmare. YA is a nightmare. Yeah.
Well, YA is a literary. I don't know if it's a genre, but it's a literary kind of market predicated on the assumption that people don't know how to read. Right. I mean, the whole notion of to call something young adult is prefaced on the fact that, well, you don't have the chops to do a full adult novel, so we'll do a young adult novel. And
No,
they're
I
so
disagree.
fucking popular. Okay, let me hear your argument. I'll dismiss it.
What are you saying that young adult authors are not as capable as adult authors?
I'm saying that the output of young adult literature is predicated on the fact that you cannot read a full adult book.
That the audience cannot read a full adult book?
Yes.
Well, yeah, but does that mean that the work itself is subpar or not very good?
By definition, because it
No, I
wouldn't be a
totally
young adult
disagree.
book. It wouldn't be a young adult book at that point.
No, I totally disagree. No, that's no.
Then what's then it's a meaningless distinction at this point. It's just a
It is a
it's just
meaningless distinction. I think it's a more of a marketing distinction than anything.
my take on it is that because I've seen the quote unquote YA books, I do think they're subliterate. At the end of the day, I don't.
Well,
think
what
that
about
they're
his
up
Dark
to the-
Materials, for instance? The
Haven't
silence
really
is
read it.
overwhelming. Oh, okay. No, his Dark Materials as a piece of literature, it's pretty decent. Okay, okay. It's not. I have issues with the trilogy, but in terms of quality, yeah, Philip Pullman does it. He brings the goods. You cannot say that Philip Pullman is not a very fine writer. Okay, I have serious problems with his Dark Materials. But to claim that he doesn't have the chops, that that he's playing in the kiddie pool because he can't swim with the big boys, no, that's just totally inaccurate. Okay.
Well, I'll take your word for it. Suffice for the fact that hey, these I'm looking at when the books came out, and I'm aware of the trilogy. I just haven't read it. 95, 97, 2000. This is pre YA being a thing. No, true. YA as we understand it really gets its act going because of Harry Potter, and Harry Potter is a subliterate series. I have read the first several books of that series. They are loaded with cliche and repetitive writing. It's not worth the time.
No, but that's not the point of it. And also, you could say the same about Dostoevsky. I mean, Dostoevsky had this weird habit of he would go for pages, for stretches of 5 to 10 pages where he'd repeat the same goddamn word, because he sort of fell in love with it for 5 or 10 pages and then move on to another word, And he did use cliches too. Just because you don't know the cliches in Russian doesn't mean that he didn't use them, right? No, I think that the Harry Potter books.
If you're going to try and say that Harry Potter is the equivalent or incomparable artistic merit to the works of Dostoevsky, I'm just sorry that is super.
You're going to quit the podcast right here and now?
I mean, honestly. I mean, think about, Crime and Punishment. Do you really think that the moral argument, the existential crisis that is resolved in Crime and Punishment equates to Harry dealing with he who shall not be named because the man has no nose?
I just want to fuck with you and see what you do. Yes.
Well,
Harry Potter is a greater hero than Raskolnikov. Yes, he is.
Well, Raskolnikov isn't a hero, and that's partly why the book's more interesting.
Oh, man. No, look. I sort of pretty much agree with what's his name, Terry Gilliam, when he said that J.K. Rowling's, for all her faults, that's my line, for all her faults, she's going to go to heaven because she got a couple of generations of kids to be interested in books. Okay, regardless of what kind of books and whether the right kind of books or not. She really made kids unafraid of tackling an 800-page book. Now that's got to be worth something. Okay. Now,
no, it's not, and I'll tell you why. Because all it produced was Twitter followers saying, "Oh my God, Trump is just like Voldemort," and "Oh my God, Harry." That if this is how they apply the book, that this is this is the parable from which that story got out. It was 2,000 or God knows how many thousands of pages of wasted effort.
So you're
That
thinking
mind
that
did
is
not grow.
you're thinking it's better to have had an illiterate generation than a generation that reads but has but is reading the wrong books?
It's at least net neutral. I mean, you're wasting your time. You're fucking wasting your time. I mean,
Oh, come on. The books
I'll,
are
I'll echo
wildly
I'll
entertaining.
echo Harold Bloom. I'll echo Harold Bloom, who said it very clearly. It's like these aren't kids reading The Wind in the Willows here. They aren't reading, the true, literature that really was meant for young, intelligent children that would get them to the next level. This is just reminding them, hey, it's good enough. You don't have to worry about really challenging yourself here. It's all good, my friend.
Oh,
Okay, you're challenged by the fact that we kind of gave you a vomiting up of a Christian parable in a very easy to digest way. Good for you. Did these kids go off and read the Bible next? Fucking no.
no, I mean, like, look, my critique of Harry Potter was that she didn't up the stakes. She should have killed off Ron Weasley. That would have been something. One of the three characters killed off. That would have just been really powerful. Okay, that's what I would have done. I would have killed him off like in the sixth book or something like that, and I would have, make the costs count. Okay, because there was a problem with the Harry Potter books and a problem with our society as a whole. We don't we try to minimize costs, and we don't want to face the facts that a lot of things come with terribly, terribly high costs. And there's this shying away from that, an inability to see that what you want can be achieved, but only at terrifying costs. Okay, and yeah, I think frankly, it's the problem of. I'll bring it all back to monetary policy to tell you the truth. I think it's the monetary policy that has skewed the reality of our society. You can have it all.
Bingo,
Yeah.
because nobody died in Harry Potter because they didn't want to fuck with potential sequels and spin-offs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I agree with that. I'm not saying that all of Harry Potter is great. No, look, the last four books are just filler. I mean, they were like these monsters, these door stoppers, but they could have been half the length or a third of the length, and they would have gotten the job done. I think that the best one was The Prisoner of Azkaban, which, interestingly enough, was the book that was filmed by the best director who did the films, Alfonso Cuarón, and it was the best of all the Harry Potter pictures, far and away the best one. And I mean, like, noticeably the funniest, the most interesting, the most dynamic. It got the job done. But look, we're not going to get into a Harry Potter argument because I don't care enough about it, and I recognize it for what it is, commercial art, and commercial art that hit a sweet spot in the zeitgeist and that took off. It could have been anything, and so I don't take it seriously, but I do know for a fact that, like it or not, they're going to be talking about Harry Potter for the next 200 years. Harry Potter is going to be on the curriculum, and it's going to, and this I know is going to have you, tearing out your hair out, right? But Harry Potter, mark my words, in 50 years will be on the syllabus of serious literature.
And that's why, frankly, the Civil War is necessary, people. Because and I'm being facetious, but also half true.
Yeah.
If this is the complacency that we're going to have, that we're going to just accept that as going to be the, what I would say, I'll give Harry Potter this. It should be nothing higher than Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is a historically important
Yeah.
B to Z grade book.
Yeah. 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 Uncle Tom's Cabin. I read it. I remember thinking nothing of it, and I remember thinking to myself that Uncle Tom was like the decent guy. So why is Uncle Tom like an insult?
Well, I mean, it's who fucking cares? I mean, it's like that the fact that we've had to accept honestly, I'll tell you this: the only good thing to come out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, I swear to God, The King and I. You want to know why? Because that fucking sequence in The King and I, when they do a Siamese opera version of Uncle, Small House of Uncle Thomas, as they say. That's the only time that story became compelling, because it became a mystical Asian story. I don't give a shit about Uncle Tom.
I never saw The King and I.
Oh, that's a wild scene. It's worth it. But that's about it. And that was, I just remembered, completely off the woods, but I remembered another book that I kind of enjoyed. Again, it's not the greatest of greats, but and I don't like the author in general. I'll tell you, the Stephen King pulled off a fairly decent kind of book recently. By recently, I mean 7 years ago now, unfortunately. His 11/22/63. So it's a genre book,
I
but in
found
the
it so
premise
boring.
is
I skipped ahead.
easily predictable.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's a man finds a passageway back to right before the Kennedy assassination, and he thinks he's going to be able to resolve it, and complications ensue. That's just I've lambasted Stephen King for being a shitty writer, and I still think fundamentally he's a shitty writer.
Yeah,
I think that was just okay. He can still belt out a book that functions, and that does kind of have there's a left-wing sentiment to the book. Let me rephrase that. There's a Democrat, big D, sentiment to that book. And I'm like okay with it at the end of the day. It's not so obsessive with it. It's not a propaganda piece as much as it could have been. I think it's just kind of functionally entertaining. Frankly, at this point, I'll take functionally entertaining. That's where we're at.
No, I think that well, Stephen King, yeah, he's never been a good writer. The one book that is exceptionally well written because it really captures the way people speak is Dolores Claiborne. That
I've
really
only seen, and I did enjoy it, so I can't speak to the book, but I am assuming it's a faithful enough adaptation.
No, actually, I remember having a long conversation with Jerry Danielle, who was well, at the time when I was in college, he became the emeritus professor of American history, and he specialized in New England history. And he was the one who pointed out that the way Dolores Claiborne, the book, captured how Maine island dwellers speak was the most accurate he'd ever read. And he was an old guy who he wasn't going to fool around, and he wasn't going to blow sunshine up Stephen King's ass just for the sake of it. It was a private conversation. So yeah, I reread the book. I enjoyed it. It was a compelling book, and I reread it, and reread it from that point of view, of that it was a brilliant regional novel, and from that point of view, yeah, he was right, because I'd met some people from Maine, and sometimes they would talk in ways that I found kind of odd, and I mean they had that patina of already Atlantic kind of mid-Atlantic university education, but sometimes they'd speak in ways that were a little bit weird. And yeah, and I saw that in Dolores Claiborne as I read it, and because like I said, I've never lived in Maine, so I wouldn't be able to. But of course, Stephen King has, and he's met tons of people who spoke like that, and so for him to be able to pull it off and do it successfully, yeah, it's surprising that he hasn't done it more often, because it was a one-off. He never did another, as far as I know, he never did another regional book like that, because Dolores Claiborne, the story, for those of you who don't know, it all takes place on this small island off the coast of Maine, and it's narrated by Dolores Claiborne, who's a maid basically in this small island, a small town on this small island. Yeah, it's really fascinating.
He's done it a few times, but not in a full-on big book kind of way. So, for example, Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption, the source material for Shawshank Redemption, arguably is regional. It takes place in a prison in Maine.
Right.
Almost all of Stephen King's books are set in Maine, outside of a handful. And he does have elements where he captures it. And that goes back to my original point of what I do like about left-wing artists is they tend to capture those details. I don't know that they still do so much, because I don't think the particularity of those details are as of interest to them in how they're educated to be authors. But when they do exhibit it, I do appreciate it. And and even Stephen King's big book that everybody probably has read, or if it's I take it back, you haven't read it, you think you've read it and you've watched the movies. That is, I do think there is a very obvious left-wing sentiment in there. Not just for the fact that all the kid, like a young girl fucks, gets a train by 4 or 5 or 6 young boys so that they could all free themselves from the monster. No, I'm talking about the acts that precipitate the monster's awakening are acts of cruelty and violence of which the monster feeds on. So historically, in the story, I think if you saw the recent movie, one of the incidents is the burning and murder of black workers in it was either a factory or some mill somewhere. But in the book, the most recent iteration, because the book takes place in 84, 85, it was published in 86, but that most recent iteration of it, the creature, happens when a guy sees a gay couple walking across a bridge and just murders them. The clown is there. It awakens as a result of it. It may have even influenced the act, but it's clearly tied to that. And he's trying to make a kind of point of the nature of how this evil feeds and how we kind of contribute to it, how you're complacent to it. So you can argue, left, right, or center about whether such yeah, but I don't think we're going to act. I wouldn't act as if those violent acts are acceptable, but I think you could argue. I said you could argue as the morality of, like I said, should gay relationships be acceptable or not? Should this be acceptable or not? I mean, Stephen King still has like a left wing attitude on
Well,
those.
I think that we've gone a little bit down the rabbit hole insofar as pursuing individual left wing writers instead of stepping back to something more interesting, which is this is the thing that I'm noticing at least. Okay, so we can agree that left wingers tend to make interesting art because they push the boundaries, because they have an ambivalent relationship with both authority and with limitations, and the limitation between imagination and reality, right? So we have that, and we have why in the Anglo-American culture at least, the the vast majority of artists of whatever medium, especially the narrative mediums of film and television and novels, they tend to be right wingers. I mean, excuse me, left wingers. But here's an interesting conundrum that we're having. The left, as of late, is becoming more and more intolerant of people breaking through social limitations because they've arguably won the culture war and they have imposed their morality on the rest of the culture. And so it is becoming impossible for left-wing writers to break through the societal limitations. I mean, they can't say that, for instance, transgenderism is a bad thing. They can't, because if they do, they become ostracized. And so they toe that line. And they start to be unable to break through, formal limitations, because those formal limitations are the limitations being taught to them in university by left-wing professors. And so maybe that's the reason that art, as of late, narrative art specifically, has become stagnant over the last 20 years. Because you and I, we can point to a couple of okay novels, but we can't say that they're, let's put it this way, the period of time between 1950 and 1970, we can rattle off 20 novels each that were really interesting, and we won't we won't have any intersection in those 20 novels. I mean, we could basically say at least 2 novels a year in that 20-year period. Between the period of 70 to 1990, we could each probably say maybe 10 novels. But the period from 1990 until today, it's a drought. And wouldn't you agree? Couldn't it be? And my proposition here, my thinking here, is that it's because the left won the culture war and became the policeman of the limitations, the societal limitations, the conceptual limitations, and that has made art stagnant over the last 20 years.
I'd phrase it this way: they ran out of things to rebel against.
Yeah, because they became the gatekeepers.
Essentially, I mean, by that, yes, when they kind of won all the battles, they are the as you said, the gatekeepers, the arbiters of the various cultural rules. So it's equivalent to the old notion that happiness writes white. If you're in the commanding levers of cultural power, I mean, what are you going to do? That like the way the way everybody sees the world is a-okay to me. They have to create phantoms, and usually that's where white privilege comes in, because it's the last phantom they can think of. But in theory, though, the right wing is all set for taking on that role. You have everything that you can bitch about, and trust me, literature, art is predicated heavily on the fact that there's a lot to bitch about in the world.
Yeah.
And that kind of is the fuel that feeds a lot of that fire. So I can imagine that a lot of right-wing minded people are ready to go and will produce that. They're just going to have to figure out a ways to get through the gatekeepers. The thing is, the left winger is dead. They got through those fucking gatekeepers. They made their own little enclaves to build it up. Eventually, they became more and more mainstream, and it's, you know, now they're the big rules. So this right wingers can do this, right? You're just going to have to find your own paths to doing it. And I would say part of the paths, regardless of your position, is write like a fucking professional, write like human beings are complex, write like the world is complicated, and be daring. That's the rules that, you know, the left-wing writers I've cited who've done well did all of that.
Yeah.
God bless them.
Yeah.
So do that. You know, I'm not telling you what to write. I'm telling you what I'm expecting in terms of, you know, what makes it good, right? And you can do that. You can fucking do that. The problem is getting someone else to publish it. That'll be the challenge. But, you know, these are things you could figure out. You'll have to big thought, closing thought at the end. I mean, I think I've said to everybody, you know, hey, this is kind of what I expect in great literature. I think the other thing, just tactically, what I would recommend is we said a number of books and films that are worth your time. I would honestly say that are left wing. You may get antsy or agitated by it, so be it, but at least you'll appreciate the craft. We mentioned the Cider House Rules. That's a John Irving book. We mentioned, you know, certainly the John Steinbeck books. You can pick your poison, anyone will do. I mentioned Do the Right Thing, a very good movie, especially, I say, the perfect movie for this time of year. Coach, what other things have we mentioned? I think there's a good list to actually worth your time, honestly.
Yeah, because, like, for instance, I always think of the Cider House Rules because it's a book that, as I get older, I am more and more against on a philosophical level, and yet the very fact that it is able to deliver an artistically and ideologically coherent point of view so strongly means that you should study it, because it's, you know, you got to study the best that your enemy has to offer, right? And I think that book is actually, I truly believe that it is the best book ever written on the pro-abortion side. I think that retrospectively and historically, I mean, in 100 years, people are going to look at that book in horror because they will consider it the same way we would consider a book that is, say, pro-slavery. We would. I don't even know a book that is pro-slavery, but any such book, we would look at it with horror and contempt. And I think that people are going to look at it with horror and contempt insofar as the Cider House Rules is concerned. And yet it is a book that you should study because it does the job really, really well. And that makes it, you got to look at it. You got to look at your enemy, the best shots that your enemy has taken to understand how to beat them. That's my thinking. And I realize as I say that it makes me sound as if I view art just as a left-winger does, as propaganda.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with you, but I would also say this. It's not as if, and I'm being serious here, you're not going to be like, oh, God, this is such a slog to read this. It feels like homework. No, they function as entertaining works of literature, art, and film. They do. That's why I watch them. That's why I read them.
Yeah. I mean, the Cider House Rules, it is not a boring book at all. It is wildly entertaining, as a matter of fact. You know, I mean, I remember reading it at an age where, you know, where you read everything. You read everything and you'll, you know, breeze through a couple of hundred pages in an afternoon. Where now, when you're older, you just don't have the time or frankly the interest or inclination sometimes, because when you're 19, you know, everything is new and you're just soaking it up. You're a sponge that's dry, right? And whereas you get to a certain age where you just start to get, you know, super saturated, if you will. But it's really worth reading. And okay, so The Conformist, that's another piece that's worth watching carefully.
I would say three Bertolucci movies are worth watching, two of which are very long, so just be prepared. So there's The Conformist, which isn't very long. There's 1900 Novecento, which is 5 hours long. Buckle up, buckaroos, if you want to watch that one. But that is Italy, the 1900 through the 40s, about the decline of the feudal system, the rise of communism and fascism. It's worth it. It takes time. And then the third is The Last Emperor, which is the antithesis of the great man theory of history. It's a Marxist reading of history. No doubt about it. It's compelling, though. It's the opposite of Citizen Kane. Citizen Kane is, Charles Foster Kane makes the world move.
Yeah.
The Last Emperor, the world makes Puyi, the Last Emperor, move.
Yeah.
He has no control over what's in his state. And it's actually a compelling take on human beings. In some instances, you just fucking don't control a goddamn thing.
Yeah.
And even if you're the emperor, you don't control a goddamn thing.
Yeah.
Very compelling story, very much worth it. Also, it takes a shot at Mao unambiguously and is dead serious about it. Mao is not a good guy in that film. Just you'll see.
I forgot.
All worth it.
Yeah, I'll have to look at it again because, again, I didn't see that movie. I saw it when it came out, and I thought it was Oscar bait at the time. I thought it was beautiful and all the rest of it, but I don't remember him taking a shot at Mao. But I'll have to watch it again. So on that note, we are going to bid you a fond farewell, my dear podcast listeners. I feel that this conversation sort of like went all over the place. We didn't have like a coherent, clear like argument agenda. We sort of like started and just sort of like wandered around. Oh, it was fun at least. I mean, ultimately that's the point of a podcast, right? It has to be fun as opposed to being all serious and academic. Would you agree, Doctor?
You're talking like the worst of left wingers. I mean, at what point were we propagandizing here? I mean, my attitude was always I wanted to give you on like a listening tour of left wing art that was kind of compelling, and I'll give you some reasons why, and I'll give you some high level perspective on what I think that says about things. If you're going to operate under the assumption that this is a thesis, examples, argument, conclusion, I mean, go write a paper for your fucking class. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
that's not what we're here for.
Yeah, and I think that you're right. I think that's the problem with left wingers as of late. That they think it's a big thesis. It's all like a term paper for a graduate school class. Depressing. Anyway,
it's a term paper for their MFA program.
Oh God, help us all. Okay, so on that cheerful note, we will bid you a fond farewell, and we will catch you next time. Take it easy.
Later.